In a courtroom where justice was meant to reign, a woman's hair fell to the floor, stripped away by a system that thought it could erase her. But 4 weeks later, she returned, not to plead, but to make the system tremble. Who was she? And what truth did she carry that no one could silence? A black woman like you, daring to raise her voice in court. You'd better hush and let that head be shaved. That's what Richard Malone, a federal security officer, declared before pressing the clipper to the scalp of someone he deemed unworthy of being heard. Yet just 4 weeks later, he stood paralyzed as she claimed the judge's bench. Her head remained bald, but her piercing gaze forced the entire system to kneel. Could such an event unfold where you reside? What state are you in? Still believing justice hinges on respecting hair. It began as a trivial hearing, scarcely registering as a minor theft case. No reporters, no high-priced lawyers, no one watching, save for 4 figures in the back, 2 officers on duty, a clerk transcribing, and a middle-aged white woman, the prosecutor, chewing her pen in silence. The courtroom resembled a tired municipal office with peeling paint, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a judge's platform raised just inches above the floor. The seats for spectators were empty. Outside, a steady drizzle fell, not enough to drench, but enough to burden everything. Such a hearing should have concluded in 5 minutes, were it not for one detail: her hair. The woman was led in with gentle restraints, not metal shackles, but a soft black nylon strap loosely circling her wrists, more like a hospital band than a cuff. Richard Malone's stare, however, was far from gentle. He stood to the side, hand on his baton, head tilted slightly, as if itching for a reason to enforce order. Natalie walked in, head unbowed, unresisting, unflinching as the light struck her face. She stood with long, natural curls cascading over her shoulders. No makeup, no preamble, no pleas. Her mere presence shifted the room's atmosphere, not because she broke any rules, but because she refused to show the fear expected of someone like her. "She won't take off the wig," Richard muttered, loud enough for the prosecutor and clerk to catch. "That hair might conceal knives, contraband. We suggest processing." Processing rolled off his tongue like a cold directive, devoid of feeling, brooking no argument. The prosecutor didn't challenge it. A man in his 50s, scrolling his phone, gave a curt nod of assent. Richard stepped forward, pulling a compact clipper from his pocket. No one rose. No one protested. No one so much as blinked. That hair, nurtured for decades, was sheared in the very space meant to uphold the law. No warrant, no documentation, no medical necessity or security mandate. Only one unspoken truth troubled the room. That hair was too bold to belong in a low-level courtroom. As it tumbled to the tiled floor, coiling in dark, heavy loops like a crushed aspiration, Richard Malone grinned. "Not a peep from her," he remarked offhandedly, switching off the clipper, leaving a stark stripe across Natalie's scalp. I expected a reaction, but nothing. She just stood there, eyes steady. A voice in the room murmured, "Impressive." Another whispered, "Something's not right. Maybe she's unstable." Yet Natalie remained silent. She gazed into the interrogation room's mirror, not to inspect her appearance, but as if anticipating something beyond the room's comprehension. She wasn't seeking justice. She was waiting for the system to expose its own guilt through an act it believed trivial. Once the processing was done, Natalie was seated on a small chair beside the judge's bench. Richard glanced at her, as if he'd just tidied up a mess for the system. No gratitude, no incident report needed. She sat, scalp bare, wrists lightly bound, exuding a calm that unnerved everyone present. Someone flicked on the air conditioning. Another gestured for coffee. But Natalie stayed still, her eyes fixed on the mirror, holding her stare for 3 deep breaths, long enough to make the onlookers feel they were the ones under scrutiny, not her. The hearing dragged on for 15 minutes. The charges barely mattered. The proposed penalty was a fine for disrupting a public institution after she refused to leave a policy seminar at the Institute of Justice despite orders. They labeled her a troublemaker, a problematic woman with mental concerns, even floated mandatory psychiatric evaluation for future incidents. The hearing felt like a clerical mistake, recycling phrases from old cases, merely swapping names and places. No one questioned her presence. No one spoke her name. The record listed only Defendant NB. Richard exited the courtroom like someone clocking out on a slow Friday. He cast a quick look back, then vanished through the corridor door, not to confirm her detention, but to ensure that Hare could never return. To him, shaving her head wasn't about security. It was about diminishing her value. Strip away a symbol, and you erase its associated memory. Tear up a family portrait, and you don't just destroy paper. You obliterate someone's legacy. But Richard didn't realize this. Each time he thought he'd silenced someone, he was unwittingly convening a different kind of trial. No jurors, no defense counsel, no official transcript, just a quiet tally of those in the room who stood by and did nothing. Natalie was escorted out without defiance, but those who observed, who listened, who averted their eyes and feigned busyness, they'd face a penalty requiring no formal charges, haunted by their own guilt under the same harsh lights as that courtroom. The door shut. No one stood. No cheers. No one recalled Natalie's name. All that remained was a small tangle of hair caught under a chair's leg. The janitor didn't sweep it up immediately. Perhaps he was too busy. Perhaps he didn't know how to handle something without a procedural code. But for whatever reason, it lingered there, a mute warning. Some things can be shaved away but never erased, and certain strands, when they fall, make no noise, yet resonate longer than any verdict you've ever endorsed. That hair stayed there for 2 days. No one touched it. No one cleared it away. On the 3rd day, a new intern, around 22, wearing red-rimmed glasses and thin latex gloves, approached, ready to gather the strands into a steel evidence tray. She hesitated, not from fear, but because it felt odd. Human hair should be logged as biological evidence, yet this bundle had no case number, no linked name, no associated file. It was merely something someone tried to erase, but left too many traces to fully succeed. In the digital records, the NB file was marked pending administrative review. No photo, no precise birth date, no attorney listed. The only entry under identifying characteristics noted: female, African American, hair processed. Below, a brief, unsigned line read, "No response during restraint." In a justice system that judges demeanor over deeds, that alone sparked suspicion. No defiance? That's questionable. No words? Something's amiss. A black woman, shaved bald before witnesses without a twitch, was something that set them on edge. She didn't match the profile of a rebel, nor did she seem submissive. She was a glitch, defying bureaucratic categorization. 3 days later, when her file reached the city's administrative review division, they needed employment details. No one knew what to input. No tax filings, no health insurance records, no trace of past jobs in public or private sectors. Temporary address. None. Her ID barcode failed to scan. Her only mark was a faint fingerprint, unmatched in the national database. She didn't exist, not as a ghost, but in a tangible sense. Every attempt to define her had failed. In a system where a click can unlock someone's identity, failing to pin her down was more unsettling than a guilty verdict. Richard Malone carried on with his routine. He didn't recall her name, if she'd even offered her true one. In his internal memo, he noted, Subject followed security protocol. No defiance noted. When pressed for details, Richard gave a lazy shrug. Nothing unusual. She stayed quiet. Her hair was long, seemed risky. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "The type who'd have been flagged ages ago if she ever spoke out." That comment was logged in an internal exchange, but no one disciplined him. It wasn't blatant enough to be called racist, nor refined enough to seem threatening. It existed in that murky space, so familiar to the system that its toxicity went unnoticed. When Natalie's NB file landed in the archives, a veteran staffer spotted a prior arrest from 18 years earlier. Cross-referencing her signature, the system flagged a match from a Boston federal courthouse. But the data was only in paper form, never digitized, never updated in the national system. The employee, thorough and experienced with intricate cases, retrieved the physical file. Inside was a grainy black and white photo, not crisp, but the hair stood out. It was Natalie, not as a detainee but as a witness, once part of a temporary special prosecution team for a case on systemic violence. Her photo was tagged inactive, not fired, not reassigned, just halted. No explanation, no notes, as if someone had quietly buried her record to avoid questions. Elsewhere, Natalie sat in a nameless holding cell, marked only by a code, 14B. The space, barely larger than a storage closet, held just enough room for one to lie down, with a sink and a metal rod for clothes. She didn't ask for a phone call, didn't demand a lawyer, didn't challenge her confinement. Facing the wall, her hair gone, scalp raw from the razor, her stare remained steady, unyielding. She studied the wall's cracks, as if deciphering an old ruling. Not another's, but her own. Each flake of peeling paint was a comma, each layer of dust a line in her story. She didn't crave release. She needed to bide her time. Resistance is often painted as fiery, bold, explosive, loud, insistent. But some resist by refusing to retreat. No surrender, no words, no easing the system's comfort as it wields power. Her refusal to react began to rattle those on the other side. They'd never say it outright, but their glances lingered when reviewing files. They swapped unique case for troublesome subject. And they started dodging blame, because no one wants to be the last standing when the truth breaks through. A week later, Natalie was moved from the holding facility. No official release, no escort, no notice, no reason given. She was placed on a civilian bus, seat 9, with just an elderly driver up front. When the bus reached the city's main transit hub, she stepped off. No one awaited her, no possessions, no ID, no phone. A middle-aged woman, nameless, hairless, and by many measures, without the right to roam downtown during work hours. Yet she moved lightly, as if she'd just fulfilled a purpose she'd set for herself. That same day, an untitled video clip appeared on an obscure online forum. No music, no captions, no edits, just raw footage of a woman's head being shaved in a courtroom. It didn't explode on mainstream platforms. Algorithms favor entertainment, not truth. But in activist circles, in hushed chats among the wrongfully detained, and in the private offices of veteran lawyers, the clip looped dozens of times. No one knew her identity, but all sensed a profound wrong. And that sparked the first cracks in the glass wall of so-called justice, once thought unbreakable. Some mornings feel like the world's still on course. Richard Malone rose at 6 a.m., took a brisk shower, shaved neatly, spritzed his usual cologne, and assured himself today would mirror every other. Driving to headquarters, he tuned into the local radio news. The anchor droned on about traffic, budgets, and protests. Nothing about the woman he'd once stood over, clippers buzzing, gaze unflinching. To Richard, that quiet was proof the matter was neatly resolved. The hearing was minor, no fallout, No follow-up. No one cared. If she held any real influence, she wouldn't have let her hair hit the floor without a word. He knew the system well. Silence equals powerlessness. But at his office, a plain brown envelope awaited on his desk. No sender, no bold stamp, just 3 stark lines. Thursday, 2 p.m., room 2, internal review. The blunt wording irked Richard. Notices like this usually came with attachments, a clear source, a stated purpose. This one was curt. No pleasantries. No sign-off. Still, he wasn't fazed. Internal reviews were standard for field officers, sometimes a citizen's grievance, sometimes departmental squabbles. Over the years, Richard had endured more audits than uniform changes, always ending with a quiet handshake, a vague warning, and a sly grin. You know the drill. Just routine. At 1:55 p.m., Richard stood outside room 2. Closed door, frosted glass, no receptionist, no badge, no sign-in sheet. Just a crooked sign. Independent review room. Entry by invitation only. Richard's brow furrowed. Independent review was rare in the system, reserved for high-level oversight, court officials, federal agents, or special inspectors. But he calmed himself. Probably just a rebrand. Bureaucrats loved new terms to sound polished. He had no cause for worry. The door clicked open at precisely 2 p.m. A faint beep sounded from the internal scanner. No one greeted him. He stepped inside. The room was chillier than expected. No drapes, no soft lights, just harsh white LEDs glaring off a metal table and 3 forward-facing chairs. A suited man typed in the corner. A blonde white woman nodded as Richard entered. Neither offered names. Neither stood. Richard took a seat, adjusted his belt, striving to project his usual calm authority. But something felt wrong. The pair across from him didn't have the look of questioners. They seemed to await something momentous. 5 minutes ticked by. Only the faint clack of keys broke the silence. Richard checked his watch. Then, a rear door creaked open. Someone entered. Not rushed, not dawdling, but with steps measured as if rehearsed. He turned to speak, but his words froze before they formed. The woman was transformed, not in looks, not because her hair hadn't regrown, but in how she carried herself, as if the room were hers, not a place she was merely summoned to. She wore a gray blouse, an unbuttoned black blazer, no makeup, no accessories, no papers. She brought only her stare, the same one Richard had once misread as vacant in the courtroom. Now it was piercing, vivid, tightening the room with its weight. Richard realized he couldn't recall her name, and that gap suddenly felt heavy. The woman he'd dismissed as nameless now stood at the table's head. She didn't sit immediately. She drew the chair back, rested a hand on its frame, surveyed the 3 of them, and let her eyes settle on him. No preamble, no courtesies. The silence held, not because they awaited her words, but because they sensed this wasn't a standard review. It was a reordering of authority, and Richard was the last to grasp. He sat at the bottom. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle, conversational. This isn't a review. No one's accused today. But every word will be logged. Richard parted his lips to reply, but she lifted a hand, not to silence, but to signal. Speak only when you know your place. For the first time in his career, Richard was at a loss. His training was for controlling scenes, not navigating one he'd never prepared for. She took her seat, opened a laptop, didn't cite a report or the incident, just let her gaze rest on his face longer than needed. Then came a question that stiffened his spine. How many people do you recall laying hands on? Richard stayed mute. She didn't push, didn't raise her tone, letting the question linger like smoke in a locked room. No one spoke for him. No union rep stepped in. In that quiet, He knew he was in a space where words wouldn't shield him. What was unfolding had begun the moment she entered. Natalie's question, seemingly a mental probe, was the first cut, stripping away decades of dust deliberately piled over her file. Richard didn't respond, not from defiance, but because he couldn't be sure he remembered. In a system where daily someone is handled, questioned, filed, moved, a brief touch, whether harmful or indifferent, blends into the grind of labels. Threat? No threat. Manageable. Ignorable. But this touch had circled back, undeniable, in the form of a woman before him. Hairless, fileless, yet wielding every bit of presence the system had spent 20 years trying to erase. In a quieter building, unmarked, a man sat before an aging monitor, its light revealing two mismatched files. One, handwritten, yellowed tape holding it together, bore a 2007 code. The other, a scanned photo, fuzzy but legible, showed United States District Court embossed above. The figure was Natalie. Thick hair, steady gaze, no smile. Below, Assistant Federal Judge, Boston Circuit. Unupdated since 2012, the system labeled her inactive. No exit reason, no misconduct, no resignation. Just one note. Duty paused. Case unresolved. The man scowled. Years in archives taught him unresolved meant a file was meant to stay buried. Back in the meeting room, Natalie set a slim stack of papers on the table. Not bulky, no fancy binding, just plain sheets tied with string. But within were fragments that, pieced together, painted a truth many hoped was forgotten. She said little about them. No exposition, no slideshow, just flipped each page deliberately, as if urging all to revisit a lost journal. Richard recognized the headings. 2007 Internal Review. Case Memo. Whistleblower denied protection. Boston Federal Court. A dull throb started in his temple. Names he thought long gone reemerged, not as an assault, but like a creeping mist, cold, clammy, choking the room. She paused on one page, a copy of Natalie's suspension order, signed by hand. No official seal, no code. The signature belonged to a chief judge Richard knew, once lauded for integrity, who slipped into retirement quietly. Natalie laid the page down without a word, but her look drained the room's air. That year, she'd been the lone voice in the prosecution unit, refusing to endorse a memo claiming proper protocol in a witness's murder case. She penned an 11-page dissent, sent to 2 oversight levels. No personal jabs, just razor-sharp logic no one could counter. But she hadn't foreseen that precision doesn't always earn respect. Her dissent went unanswered, unrefuted, unacknowledged. It vanished from public records, surviving only in a private email she'd sent herself. From then, her appointments were canceled without cause. Speaking gigs were rescinded. Her name was scrubbed from the local law school's faculty list. No one sacked her. They just ensured she had nowhere to turn. Richard read the dissent's final line, underlined in red by an unknown hand. She must be isolated. He met Natalie's gaze, steady, not vengeful, not blaming, just assessing. Did he remember? If not, did he belong in this room, labeled as an invited party? The typist's fingers tapped on in the corner. The blonde woman lowered her eyes, dodging Natalie's stare. The room's air felt squeezed, not by the paper's words, but by what no one dared voice. A former federal judge, the last ethical voice in a fraud case, had been erased. Not deleted, but disconnected, her existence rendered meaningless. Now she sat here, no rank, no formal power, but with every shred of evidence to trace each cut made. Richard tried to speak, but his throat was parched. His usual poise had fled. He knew when someone like her returned, not with fanfare or pleas, but to restore the balance the system had warped. Everyone who'd abetted that distortion, even with a nod, would pay. Not with penalties, but with the stark realization of seeing themselves in an unfinished file. Richard had never felt a room shift so sharply without noise, proclamation, or formal ruling. No titles were declared, no roles assigned. No one rose to transfer power. Yet everything, the cold white light on the table, the open files, the transcriber's eyes, tilted as if an unseen pivot had flipped everyone's place. The woman at the table's head, still Natalie, was no longer the one shaved, no longer a partial record, but a force no one dared name. Naming her would admit she alone held the right to question, and all others were bound to answer. No one ordered Richard to rise, but in a fog he found himself half standing, not defending himself, but instinctively posturing before someone of higher stature. A federal judge, even one erased from payrolls, speaker lists, academic rosters, and legal archives, still bore a presence that made her silencers flinch. Natalie didn't need to claim superiority. Her being commanded the room to acknowledge it. Richard sat, but felt himself sinking under the burden of every detail Natalie laid out. No charges, no formal accusations, no harsh words. Yet each page she presented struck like a metronome, cold, steady, exact, against the confidence he'd built over years in the field. He once thought power meant controlling the moment, out-talking others, framing issues faster. Now, he couldn't hold her gaze, not because Natalie was aggressive, but because she didn't need to be. That was the most chilling part. A transcriber started. "Ms. Natalie, do we—" The question died. Natalie tilted her head faintly. No nod, no shake, just enough to signal this wasn't her waiting for approval. This was the system facing what it had dismissed as forgettable. Richard hadn't spoken. He knew any word could turn into evidence, not for a courtroom, but for the moral ledger Natalie was reconstructing, piece by piece. She didn't give a speech. She said, "Shaving someone bald in court is called a precaution. But when that person has judged hundreds as a federal judge, it's no longer routine. It's a statement." The words weren't aimed at anyone, but Richard felt heat climb his neck. She was stripping his actions from the shield of duty, exposing them under the scrutiny of someone who'd once probed federal ethics, where truth needed no footage, only logic too tight to escape. "Someone asked me once," she went on, "why I didn't protest, didn't fight, didn't sue. I thought it a cruel question, but I later saw it's how people convince themselves they'd have acted differently." Richard's throat was dry. He glanced around. No one's expression shifted. No one backed him. No one championed Natalie. That silence was the reply. Power lies not with the system's current favorites, but with those it can no longer dismiss. She turned to a new page. Not an old memo, but Richard's performance review from 2 years prior. One line knotted his stomach. Officer Malone often trusts gut over protocol, sometimes sidestepping rules for snap decisions. He recalled the writer, a supervisor, later moved for poor team unity. He'd thought it petty revenge. Now, those words lay bare, chosen by Natalie to remind him. Nothing he thought erased was truly gone, retrievable by someone patient enough to wait. Richard looked at her. She didn't return it, reading another passage, not to wound, but to summon her own truth. Her eyes slowed, her voice softened. In a system meant to shield the weak, sometimes the strongest must vanish to protect the principle. No one responded, but all understood. She was revealing why she faded, not forced out, but because staying would have warped her. Now she was back, not to retake a role, but to show the role was never lost. She'd just never filled it as they expected. Richard recalled that day, the clipper's harsh buzz as he shaved her. What had he felt? He'd called it necessary. Now he wasn't certain. The woman before him, whose hair once marked a history the system tried to bury, made him feel diminished, not because she loomed larger, but because he saw how low he'd always been. No one rose, no one stirred, no one broke in as Natalie placed her hand on her laptop and pressed a key. A faint white glow lit the screen. No title, no preamble, no timestamp, just a raw image, unpolished, unnarrated, in a room too cold for judgment. Richard knew what was coming. He also knew he couldn't ask to stop it. What was about to play wasn't just a record. It was living proof. An act, once buried in administrative oblivion, now undeniable. Yet he wondered, would Natalie show it to confront or to open an unspoken charge? Could one frame halt a system so used to ignoring personal pain? The video started. No music, no voiceover, just a steel door's creak, and Natalie led into the low-tier courtroom, wrists tied with black nylon. She stood tall, head high, no struggle, no response. No one greeted her. No one named her. Only Richard, uniformed, approached, clippers humming. The blade's sharp whine cut through the speakers, a stark reminder of a past no one could claim ignorance of. The clipper's first pass on Natalie's hair echoed coldly, not from the metal, but from slicing a symbol of personal dignity, not evidence or contraband, but an extension of her being. Some in the room held their breath. Richard stared at the screen, eyes fixed, seeking a glitch to grasp. Some blur to argue the image wasn't clear, wasn't real, wasn't damning. But the footage offered no escape. It didn't shift angles, didn't cut, didn't speed up. It played in real time, with every motion's cruelty unfiltered. Each stroke across her scalp landed like a silent strike against the system's touted principles: procedure, safety, response. As long, black curls fell to her shoulders, slid down her back, caught on a police boot. No one could call it necessary. No rule demands a woman's head shaved in court unless it's meant to send a signal. She said nothing in the video. Her eyes, through the grainy lens, stayed strikingly calm. Not defiant, not begging, not seeking empathy. She stood as the sole witness to an act the system now rushed to defend. That made people look away, not from unbearable truth, but from a truth too steady, leaving no words to refute it. Richard's hands shook, not from fear, but because the video stripped the system's last shield, the ability to reshape events favorably. He'd believed any misstep could be spun in a report. Now, an unedited reality played. No blood, no cries, no reaction, yet heavier than any courtroom charge. 4 minutes. That was the video's length. In those 4 minutes, the room, Richard, the typist, the supervisor, Natalie, stayed mute. No coughs, no keystrokes, no steps. Only the clipper's hum, the sound of falling hair, and a silence that seeped into a room too used to formal debate. When the screen darkened, no one touched the keyboard. Natalie gave no closing remark. She looked forward, as if waiting for another to speak. But none could. Every word would sound like feeble defense. Any excuse would only bear one truth. They'd seen and done nothing. That silent, raw truth was a judgment no system could overturn. Richard bowed his head, not admitting guilt, but with no cause to hold it high. His once commanding posture, strong in meetings, firm with lawyers or reporters, was useless. He wasn't convicted, but in Natalie's eyes and the others' averted glances, he'd crossed a line, not because she called him wrong, but because she didn't need to. The video had spoken. The 4-minute silence had done what no report or ethics probe could, forced the system to hear without interrupting. When the video ended, the screen fading to black, the room stayed hushed. Eyes didn't connect or avoid. No coughs, no paper rustling, No hint, the review continued. All thought and motion seemed paused in an unnamed moment. But Natalie didn't linger. She raised her head, not focusing on Richard or anyone, letting her gaze drift into the tense air. Then, for the first time in the meeting, she spoke. "I know what you're all wondering," she said deliberately, each word cutting the room's haze like a knife. "Why didn't I weep? When my head was shaved in court, why didn't I scream, resist, defend myself? If I didn't, doesn't that mean I accepted the shame?" She paused, not for pity or sympathy, but to lodge the question where it belonged, beyond theory or legal debate, in a raw space rarely broached outside trauma seminars, and even less from someone who'd lived it. "My hair," she continued, "wasn't a badge. It wasn't style. It wasn't about race or politics. It was my last tie to a mother I couldn't name for over 2 years. Her voice held steady. No cracks, no sobs, no quivers. Yet each word tightened an invisible thread across the room, binding all present. No one moved, not from reluctance, but from knowing any action would dishonor, not her, but the memory she drew from shadow, where none had the right to intrude. "At 8, she said, "my mother died at a police officer's hand, trying to shield my aunt's car from a search. They suspected weapons. They were mistaken. My mother, 6 months pregnant, didn't yell or fight. She stood by the door and said, 'This is my sister's car. She's done nothing.' They didn't check. 1 baton strike to her temple. No gun, no shots, just a fatal choice. And a woman vanished from the system, as if she'd never been. Natalie hadn't wept till now, nor was her voice serene. It was soft, the kind that pulls listeners close, breathless, facing their powerlessness before a truth they can't undo. Her name went in the report. They claimed she tripped and hit her head from defiance. No lawyer, no video, no advocate. They returned her belongings, a wooden comb and a single braid, long, black, tied with red thread. That braid I never cut, not to cling to her, but to keep the world from forgetting, too, that someone loved me with all she had. The final line wasn't a tale. It was a hammer, solid and final, like a gavel strike, but from no hand. Richard met Natalie's gaze. Resistance was gone. She wasn't sharing to blame him or guilt him. She spoke because truth merits a place, even unasked. And because no one had asked, she chose this moment, when none could interrupt. My hair, she stressed, was my only link to that memory. Not glamorous, not chic, not trendy, but mine. It was a little girl's, standing at a funeral, not grasping why her mother was buried with no explanation. Richard swallowed hard. No one demanded his apology, nor offered escape, for silence, the only refuge, had been used thoroughly. "I didn't weep," Natalie said, eyes locked on the table's center, "because tears would have gifted those who thought they'd schooled me. I didn't resist because fighting would have admitted weakness. I stood still, so they'd own their act without excuses comfort." No one answered. The silence wasn't calm. It was a weight, freezing all, fearing a breath might break the gravity of her words. "When a black woman doesn't cry," she finished, "don't think she feels no pain. She may hold something dearer, not to conceal, but to wait. To show some pain needs no scream. It persists, quietly, fiercely, until it's something none dare erase." When Natalie stopped, the silence didn't fade. It hardened, a dense, unspoken force over all. No one spoke, but eyes turned aside, not from fear or guilt, but because looking as equals would force facing more than apology. Each had upheld the justice Natalie had just laid bare. She didn't end with her story. Her voice sharpened, not louder, not angrier, but clearer, as if etched long ago, awaiting this moment. "I'm not the only one this system erased," she said, placing a thicker folder, bound in black cloth, on the table. I've held my tongue, waiting for another to speak for them. None did. So today, I will. She opened it. Not sharing, not displaying, just reading aloud, as if each line were a sacred vow to let buried souls rest. Maya Stone, 16, arrested for a knife in her school bag, a fruit knife, from her mother, for lunch. No threats, no harm, no complaints. She paused, then pressed on. Held at District 4 Juvenile Center. 3 days later, dead in her cell. Cause: suicide by shoelace. But footage vanished. 17 minutes blacked out at that exact time. Richard's throat tightened, not for the name, but those 17 minutes he'd testified about in a review, signing a claim of a software glitch, knowing no update happened. Natalie didn't name him. She didn't need to. He knew, and she knew. That sufficed. Maya's mother couldn't see her body for 4 days, was barred from medical files. When she got the remains, bruises marked the neck, but the autopsy called it post-mortem trauma. No charges, no accountability. She, like me, was erased, a typo not worth fixing. Natalie's eyes swept the room. What's this called? A mistake? An oversight? The cost of a vast system? Or do we cling to the word that keeps us righteous? Justice? No one replied. Any word would shred the papers before her, not for their fragility, but their undeniable weight. She went on. Here's Joseph T., 14, arm broken in detention for stealing a pencil box, no charges. Tamara O., strip searched awaiting her parents, no medical need, no reckoning. Khalil R., mute after 2 weeks in solitary, blamed on headbanging, per the report. And many others, quietly erased because their truths didn't fit reports, shielding us from blame. Richard's head dropped. He hadn't touched all those cases, but each time he stayed quiet, signed vague files, ignored details thinking higher-ups would handle it. Those moments echoed in her steady voice. He wasn't tried, but his innocence was gone. Natalie closed the folder, raised her head. I don't need your agreement, she said. Not coldly, not emotionally. I need you to admit our justice is a choice. Who's guarded, who's discarded silently. When I was shaved, I wasn't the first. Just the first to return, stand and say, you're wrong. You've been wrong too long. No one spoke. The blonde note-taker set her pen down, hand trembling. The supervisor's gaze fell to his folder, as if seeing a truth he'd known but never faced. Richard sat still. No rebuttals, only a faint pulse in his chest, not from speakers, but within, a reminder. Some trials need no gavel, no accuser, no verdict, yet change you forever. When Natalie shut the last folder, no applause, no nods, no formal response came. Only slight shifts. The scribe's eyes, the supervisor's bowed head, Richard's clenched fists, bodies bracing for an impact from within the system they called protocol. The review ended without a declared close. Natalie rose slowly. No goodbye, no permission sought, no final word. She left the room as if she'd never entered, leaving one thing none could grasp: the truth. News of the review didn't spread fast. No bold headlines, no viral posts. Mainstream media stayed mute, as if the story lacked prime-time weight. But in dusty editorial basements, someone got a 4-minute video via an anonymous link. They watched, doubted, rewatched, and called colleagues. No one knew the sender or if it was authentic. But the lack of narration, no anchor, no voiceover, no title, struck first, its raw clarity impossible to twist. On day 2 post-review, a brief piece ran in a local paper's community stories. Unnamed woman shaved in hearing. Video sparks judicial questions. It made no claims, gave no judgments, just described the scene. Within 2 hours, The link was removed for unverified content. No one knew who ordered it. The editor was shifted to food coverage. The writer's name vanished from contributors. The story didn't die. It was sidelined, like all unapproved truths. On day 3, a state senator called for a public inquiry. His office soon faced an ethics review. No charges, no accusations, but his calls went unanswered, meetings delayed, proposals dropped for procedural vagueness. The issue wasn't stopped, it just vanished officially. The system didn't admit ignorance or error. It said nothing. It delayed meetings, canceled briefings, dodged interviews, and steered coverage to safe stories. A school commencement, a new firehouse, a dog reunited with its owner after months. Soft headlines, enough to convince readers all was well, as if no one was shaved in court, as if no one died in custody for a fruit knife. Richard watched from his office, fluorescent lights humming, clock ticking, as if no review had occurred. No one asked about Natalie, sought his statement, or mentioned the meeting. But he knew the silence was deliberate, structured, directed, purposeful, to shield the system from its own deeds. For the first time, Richard saw silence, not as absence, but as action, a tool. When denial fails, they stall. When distortion falters, they dilute. When bending breaks, they bury. When they can't discredit the witness, they act as if she never was. Richard gazed out his window at a post office line across the street. They, too, were silent, unaware of that woman or those 4 minutes. But he knew. The system knew. Better than anyone. 3 days later, at a routine press conference, a young journalist asked the state attorney general about the video. The justice head paused, gave a practiced smile, and said, "We lack enough data to confirm the video's authenticity. All protocols are under thorough review." No follow-ups, no pushback. No one wanted an audit. The story was shelved again. Natalie didn't appear in media. She didn't post, refute, confirm, or deny. She let the system expose itself through evasion. No protests, no trending tags. She left a gap, just wide enough for justice to fill with its own silence. They thought silence would let memory decay, that an act, unrecorded in words, images, or stamps, would fade into the system's dusty files. They forgot some things need no record, no transcript. They need only memory. And I, Natalie, never had the luxury of forgetting. Not because I held on, but because their eyes carved a truth no ruling could erase. A silence that speaks. I still recall that day, my head shaved in court, not for its uniqueness, but because too many saw it. People mistake the crime for the one holding the blade. But my years in justice taught me. The culprit is often the one who looks away as it falls, seals lips in the hall, hearing metal cut hair, but stays put, types notes without pause, awaiting orders. The first I saw was the prosecutor, platinum blonde, red lipstick, long coat despite mild weather. She said nothing in the hearing's 20 minutes, but her glance, not shocked, not caring, slid over me like I was an obstacle to protocol's end. As Richard started the clippers, she didn't avert her eyes, nor focus. Her gaze hovered between me and the camera, as if that space excused her. She opened her laptop, typed briefly, closed it, like finishing a clerical task, not witnessing dignity's theft. The second was the stenographer. His name's unknown, but his shoes, black, polished, left heel worn, stand out. He typed fast with middle fingers. When Richard neared, his hand stilled for a second, then resumed. Perhaps he pondered. Log this? Perhaps he thought, this isn't official. Like others, he skipped it, easier than admitting he recorded a self-evident cruelty needing no proof. I recall the officer by the door. He did nothing, didn't grin,